Okay, so let's look at Exodus. And we're just surveying through Exodus. This is a really big picture of Exodus. We look at the breakdown of Exodus. We see God saving Israel from Egyptian bondage. We see God gives Israel the law. And like we spoke about in the first session, law is just, the Torah is also instruction. And yet it's also narrative. So when we say God gives Israel his instructions, again, it's to be his people, to be his image-bearing people that humanity has failed to be. And in fact, that's one of the lines of reasoning throughout Scripture. You even find that in Romans 5, is even Israel fails to be God's image-bearers. Because when you go to Genesis 5, we see Seth is in the image of Adam. In other words, humanity's image has been corrupted. No longer is humanity in the image of God, which we should have been, but we reject that. And so the rest of the story is how God is going to redeem humanity and restore our image. So for us today as disciples, our image is being renewed in the image of Christ. And when Jesus returns, our image will be fully in his image. In 1 Corinthians 15:49. But here we see God giving his people instructions on how to be his people. And then God commands Israel to build a tabernacle, which again goes back to Genesis 1, what cosmos was supposed to be the temple. And temple is where God's space, human space is one. But sin, because of sin and rebellion, we are now split. And God now comes and tabernacles with his people. And that we find that in Exodus chapter 40. So if you break it down, it's salvation, law, and worship. And that's really the big picture of Exodus. So what we're going to do now is, again, applying the hermeneutic triad, we're going to look at the geography of the text. It's a little bit of Egyptian history. Now, I'll just say this before we go into it. This is not please don't be dogmatic on what we're about to discuss. Even scholars aren't sure the actual time frame of Exodus and so on. So what I'm presenting is a perspective that perhaps can be helpful. I've given some reasoning and so on. So again, take it for that, and it perhaps can help with the actual text in Exodus. But please be mindful of avoiding being dogmatic. So with that being said, it is something very interesting. You have in Egypt, you have the upriver, Upper Egypt. It's called Upper Egypt even though it's in the south because of the flow of the Nile River. It's flowing upward. And you have Lower Egypt, which is which you would think would be the other way around, but it's Lower Egypt because of the flow of the Nile River, and it's called the Nile Delta. And what's really interesting is that there's this Semitic tribe or Semitic people called Hyksos that ruled Lower Egypt in between 1630 and 1530 BC. Now, so they weren't local Egyptians, right? They were Semitic tribe from further up north that came in from up there somewhere. They came here and they ruled. That could explain why Joseph, who would be a brethren for them, right? He's also of a Semitic tribe, would be given such prominent role in administrating Egypt. Does that make sense? So that's again a conjecture, and I guess a theory put forth, but it makes sense. Now, as you can imagine, being ruled by a foreign entity is not to the liking of local Egyptians, right? So then they're defeated. The Hyksos are defeated by the local Egyptians, so they can then take over. And that is maybe why you find that the Israelites fall out of favor, perhaps. Again, we're not completely sure, but that's a theory put forth. Now, so when did Exodus happen? And who was in power in Egypt? Now, this is the 18th dynasty, and so the Moses, they defeat Hyksos and they take over. And so from then on, you find this steady expansion. It's an imperialistic expansion. And you have these Amenhotep and Thutmose, and they continually are expanding. But the one that I want to focus on, and they're going up here, up north. They're going up north, and they're steadily expanding. The two of the other prominent empires, which weren't empires, I shouldn't say empires, but prominent powers of that time, were the Mitanni and the Hittite. Although at that point, they weren't the prominent ones. They weren't the most powerful. But as you can see, Egypt slowly starting to establish their authority, their power. Now, the one that I wanted to zero in on is Thutmose the third. Now, when he comes into power, when he becomes a pharaoh, he's only 5. So his auntie, and she's, I think, 1 or 2, if I'm not mistaken, but she's certainly one of the first, if not the first, female pharaohs. So that's kind of cool. They had a female pharaoh, but apparently she dressed like a man. So, yeah, she's so Hatshepsut. I don't know how to pronounce it. But that's her name, and I'm not going to wear it out. So now she secured the borders, and she really she was there till her nephew, I guess, came of age. But it sounds like when Thutmose got in power, he tried to just sort of wipe out all of her traces, and I guess for whatever reason. But what he does is he starts to really establish a very, very strong Egyptian empire. It's now like the powerhouse. It's the superpower of their age. And so, subsequent to that, you have Amenhotep, who continues the alliance with Mitanni, and then Thutmose the fourth continues the alliance. So it's a possibility that the pharaoh during the oppression of Israelites was Thutmose the third, and the pharaoh who is the pharaoh of the Exodus, because there are 2 pharaohs, right? During the oppression and then subsequent to the actual Exodus is Amenhotep the second. So it's possibility that these 2 are. So again, you don't have, like I said, it's not to be dogmatic, but the reason I give you this historical background is to say that Egypt was a powerful empire. Yeah. So this is an exceptionally powerful world empire, at least the world of that time. Okay? Now with that background, let's read Exodus 5, verse 1. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." So notice he's speaking to the most powerful man, if not one of the most powerful men in that day and age. Okay? And then Pharaoh says to Moses, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." So the historical context is to remind us that Moses went to speak to one of the most, if not the most powerful man on earth. It was an exceptionally powerful empire. So hopefully that gives us some context when we read Exodus, that this would have been an exceptionally foolish request coming from a bunch of slaves that honestly, and they don't even know their names. Like this is a persona non grata. These are non-existent people going to the most powerful man on earth saying, "You need to let us go now." So you can understand the responses that Pharaoh has is not that out of place. You know, it would be consistent with someone who has tasted power and who's had generational power and is in control of his empire to even entertain a request that Moses makes. But I wanted to kind of go underneath this verse a little bit because, again, notice the narrative. It starts in Genesis 1. God creates humanity to be with us, right? To be with humanity. And this word "know" is the Hebrew word "yada." And it's a really amazing word. And I'll just give due credit to Dr. Giles. I learned from him in the Rocky Mountain School of Theology. And he has this whole thing called Yada theology, which is really, really good stuff. And it's to know. And I'll give you how this word is used in other parts of the Bible, and you can understand how powerful this word is. So here's Adam made love to his wife, Eve. That word, made love to his wife, that's a phrase called Adam yada his wife. That's the level of intimacy. I know it's shocking as it sounds, but God uses that word yada to explain sexual intimacy and intimacy with him. What does that mean? That means that's how intimately God desires a relationship with us. He wants to yada us, and he wants us to yada him. And Pharaoh says, I do not yada Yahweh. I don't know God. Who is this God? I don't know. You know, going back to Genesis 1:27, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them, said to them, be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea, birds in the sky, over every living creature that moves on the ground. Again, a royal vocation. Who gave Pharaoh the right to rule? God did. Yahweh did. And he says, I don't know who this God is. And that's part of what we are supposed to get out of Exodus, is this tragedy of not knowing God. And this is a clash of worldviews, a clash of empires. God's way, Yahweh, or your way. and Egypt constantly uses their way, or so does the rest of humanity. There's a clash of empires. Why? Because how did Pharaoh rule? And it says in Exodus 1:11, they put slave masters over them, oppressed them, forced labor. He abused and oppressed God's image bearers. In Exodus 2:24, God heard their groaning and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. This is tragic. This is human tragedy. Because we can read Exodus, and I have done this. I don't know if you have, but I have done this, and I've looked at it and gone, I don't know, because it seems like God's got Israel and he's trying to rescue them, but he kills off the pharaohs, Egyptians. Like, how fair is that? It's like, in America they have Thanksgiving, Happy Thanksgiving, and I always say, like, well, not for the turkeys, it's not, because you eat turkeys on Thanksgiving, right? But so I always wrestled with that. Like, what about the Egyptian point of view? It doesn't seem right that Egypt would. But look at Exodus 7 verse 5. And the Egyptians will yada, that I am the Lord, when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out of it. God wants Egypt to know him. He's not picking favorites. In fact, there's a whole analysis, and if you're interested, I can send you the paper I wrote on Romans 9 and the favoritism. And in fact, I think that's the logic Paul uses to say God does not play favorites. God does for both Israel and Egypt like he does for all of us, to come to know him. And I won't digress into that now. Just to say, I'll leave this question to you. Is Israel's idolatry with the golden calf any different than Egyptians' worship of all the false gods? And I think that's the logic Paul uses in Romans 9. He says, no. He does for both Pharaoh and Israel what He does for all of us. He wants all of us to know Him, and we are the ones who reject Him. But this is the heart of God. I want the Egyptians to know. And it just does not work out like that because of human sin. We're not in the image. We've exchanged our image for a bowl full of soup, But that's the tragedy. And so Exodus 12, on that same night I passed through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. So this is another key reason why these plagues came on the Egyptians, is there is a direct judgment to all the gods in small g of Egypt. So God creates us one God, Genesis 1, and in Exodus you have all these gods populating human existence. And Yahweh, the one God, says, no, it can't happen. It can't happen. That can't be allowed. Why can't it be allowed? Because there is only one God. I am the creator God. I want you to know me. I'm the one who wants to come tabernacle with you. All these other gods are there to abuse you, to hurt you, to harm you. It's no different than my son and me. How many fathers does he have? He has one father. I'm his dad. No one else can be his dad. I'm getting emotional just even thinking that, because I am his dad. I love him so much that no one else can be his dad, and no one else will care for him like I do. Yeah. And if anyone makes that claim, they are lying. They're absolutely lying, and there's an ulterior motive. If someone else goes to him and says, "I'm your dad," Luke, I'm your father. Rain, I'm your father. Like, you're Darth Vader, my friend. You're not this dad. And that's the context we ought to read in. Otherwise, we lose the plot, and then we go into weird spaces. Why is God picking Israel over Egypt and all that kind of thing? So again, I'm saying that because as we teach the Bible, as we process it for ourselves, as we minister to people, we're meant to help people navigate that. Legitimately good questions, and navigate scripturally. Numbers 33, again it repeats that the Israelites set out from Ramses on the 15th day of the first month, the day after the Passover. They marched out defiantly in full view of all Egyptians who were burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord had struck down among them, for the Lord had brought judgment on their gods. And I realize we live in a world that does not like the word judgment. Like, it's just not cool. Yeah. But again, back to my analogy of me being Dwayne's dad, if anyone else came and claimed that, I have to judge them. I have to do that. And my son will judge them. And he say, "You're not my dad." Hopefully. If he comes to them and says, "Hey, how about I buy you whatever toys you want," and that's exactly what's happening. Would my son go, "Maybe you are my dad," and my dad is not my dad, and that's what happens, right? We reject God as our Father because we think these pretenders are going to give us what God our Father won't. So hopefully that makes sense, as we process this. So I won't go through the slide. This is the 10 plagues of Egypt versus the gods of Egypt. I'll send this out to you. But it's really interesting how each plague is a judgment, indictment on one of the gods or multiple gods of Egypt. But another thing happens here too. In Exodus 6 verse 7, "I will take you as my own people. I will be your God." And then watch what happens. "Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians." Who do the Israelites in Egypt think are their gods? Is it Yahweh? Or is it the gods of Egypt? What would they be most familiar with? Who are they being indoctrinated to believe are gods and goddesses Now picture, just imagine being an Israelite slave. You're you're making bricks, and who would you think the gods favor? You or the oppressor? I mean, it's very clear, right? The oppressor would be the one most likely, legitimately, has the favor of the Lord or gods, gods, goddesses. Because if gods favored you, you wouldn't be making bricks. You would be carrying the whip. And God's saying, I want you to know me, know the God who created the universe. So for Israelites, the Yada God, to know God, they would have to see them as, they would have seen the Egyptian gods as powerful. And so God is telling them they're not. I am Yahweh. I am God. And so that's another undercurrent of Exodus is God of Genesis 1 is now being replaced by the fake false gods and goddesses. And God of Genesis 1 wants the world to know. He wants His people, through whom the whole world will know, to know. And Egypt becomes, and that's where it's real, but it's also symbolic across the scriptures as that, it's like Babylon. It's like that empire that is always contrary to God's desire, God's image-bearing vocation for humanity. Does that make sense? Like, it's really important that we keep this perspective, or else we can then get into trouble when we read the denarrativized version of Exodus. So the big picture of Exodus is salvation, law, and worship. Now we'll look at law when we see Deuteronomy, and law within the context of covenant. We'll look at covenant a little bit more, because it's really important. Otherwise we misplace what law is, and then we get into all kinds of interesting trouble. And then I spoke about the temple. We won't go much into it, but again, pretty much chunks of Exodus is about the building of the tabernacle. And if and I hope you read it, it's this, it at times seems tedious and details of building the tabernacle. But now you hopefully can see why. It's because God wants to dwell with His creation. His creation has rejected Him. God takes a subset of His creation, who then find themselves in exile. They find themselves in slavery in Egypt, repeating the pattern of humanity. He rescues His people with a mighty hand, gives them instructions on how to live as His people, and then instructs them to build a tabernacle so He can come dwell with His people, with the hope that eventually He'll dwell with all of humanity.